It was just another quiet afternoon in the neighborhood. Birds chirping, kids playing in the distance, and the faint hum of lawnmowers cutting through the warm air. But what started as an ordinary day would soon spiral into a moment that would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about their community. It all began when Karen, a woman known for her nosy tendencies and quick calls to 911, spotted something that didn't sit right with her. A man, a black man, was standing on his own porch, fiddling with the lock on his front door. To most people, this would have been a non-issue. After all, it was his house, his door, his lock. But to Karen, it was a red flag, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling with a mix of self-righteousness and fear. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the line. Karen took a deep breath, her tone dripping with urgency. There's a man trying to break into a house on my street. I think he's up to no good. You need to send someone right away. Little did she know, this call would set off a chain of events that would expose secrets, challenge assumptions, and leave everyone involved reeling. Because the man on the porch wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a criminal. He was Marcus, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, and he was simply changing his own door lock. But what he discovered in the process would change everything. As Marcus worked on the lock, he noticed something strange. The mechanism felt off, like it had been tampered with. At first, he brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just wear and tear. But the more he examined it, the more he realized something wasn't right. His instincts kicked in, and he decided to take a closer look. What he found would send chills down his spine. Hidden inside the lock was a small, unfamiliar device. Something that didn't belong there. Marcus's mind raced. Who could have put it there? And why? He had no idea that his discovery was about to unravel a mystery far bigger than he could have imagined. Meanwhile, Karen watched from her window, convinced she'd done the right thing by calling the police. She felt a sense of satisfaction, as if she'd single-handedly protected the neighborhood from some unseen threat. But as the sirens grew louder and the police car pulled up to Marcus's house, the tension in the air became palpable. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached Marcus. Karen held her breath, waiting for the moment when they'd confirm her suspicions. But what happened next was nothing like what she expected. Marcus, calm and collected, explained the situation to the officers. He showed them the device he'd found, and their demeanor shifted instantly. This wasn't a routine call anymore. This was something much bigger. The officers began asking questions that made Karen's stomach churn. Why had she been so quick to assume the worst? What had she missed? And most importantly, what was really going on in their quiet little neighborhood? As the investigation unfolded, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow, every sound seemed to carry a new layer of meaning. He knew he had to get to the bottom of this, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. The device in his lock was just the beginning, and whatever was coming next would test his courage, his patience, and his faith in the people around him. Karen, too, found herself caught in a web of doubt and regret. Her call to 911 had set everything in motion, but now she was starting to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. What Marcus found out next would shock everyone. Karen, the police, and the entire neighborhood. Secrets would be revealed, alliances would be tested, and the truth would come at a cost. But for now, the tension hung in the air, unresolved and unrelenting. What was the device in the lock? Who had put it there? And what did it mean for Marcus and everyone around him? The answers were coming, but not without a fight. And as the sun set on that fateful day, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. As the police officers examined the strange device Marcus had found in his door lock, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The quiet street, usually filled with the sounds of everyday life, felt eerily still. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious but cautious, as the scene unfolded. Marcus stood on his porch, his arms crossed, trying to make sense of it all. He'd lived in this house for years, always feeling safe and secure. But now, that sense of safety was shattered. The device in his hand was small, no bigger than a thumb drive, but its presence was ominous. It didn't belong there, and someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. Who? And why? Karen, still watching from her window, felt a knot of unease tighten in her chest. She had expected the police to handle the situation quickly, maybe even arrest Marcus, but instead, they were treating him with respect, listening intently as he explained what he'd found. Her certainty began to waver. Had she misjudged the situation? She replayed the moment in her mind. Marcus, standing on his porch, tools in hand, working on his lock. It had seemed suspicious at the time, but now she wasn't so sure. Her call to 911 had been impulsive, driven by a mix of fear and a desire to protect her community. But what if she'd been wrong? What if she'd made everything worse? The officers asked Marcus if he had any idea who might have tampered with his lock. He shook his head, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've lived here for years," he said. "I've never had any issues. This doesn't make sense." The officers nodded, their expressions grim. They took the device and promised to look into it. But Marcus could tell they were just as puzzled as he was. As they left, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Someone had invaded his privacy, and he needed to find out why. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his living room, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He thought about his neighbors, the people he'd waved to for years without really knowing them. Could one of them be behind this? He hated to think it, but the possibility lingered. He decided to start paying closer attention to his surroundings, to notice the little things he'd always overlooked. Maybe there were clues he'd missed, signs that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Karen couldn't stop thinking about the look on Marcus's face when the police had arrived. It wasn't the face of someone guilty or dangerous. It was the face of someone confused, even scared. She felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. She'd done what she thought was right, hadn't she? Still, the doubt gnawed at her. She decided to do something she rarely did. Reach out to Marcus. She didn't know what she'd say, but she felt like she owed him an explanation. Or maybe even an apology. The next morning, Karen knocked on Marcus's door, her heart pounding. When he opened it, she was struck by how tired he looked. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Marcus hesitated but nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat in his living room, the air thick with tension. Karen took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I shouldn't have called the police without knowing the whole story. I thought I was doing the right thing." Marcus studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I get it," he said, "but you have to understand how it feels to be judged just because of how I look. I was just trying to fix my lock. I didn't expect all of this to happen." Karen nodded, her guilt growing. She realized how little she knew about Marcus, about his life, his struggles. She'd made assumptions based on fear, and it had led to this. As they talked, Marcus mentioned the device he'd found. Karen's eyes widened. "What do you think it is?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not just a random thing. Someone put it there for a reason." Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She thought about the quiet street, the familiar faces she saw every day. Could someone in their neighborhood be capable of something like this? The idea was unsettling. Over the next few days, Marcus began to notice small, strange things. A car he didn't recognize parked down the street. A neighbor who seemed to be watching him more closely than usual. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched never went away. He decided to install security cameras around his house, just to be safe. If someone was targeting him, he needed to know. Karen, too, started paying more attention to her surroundings. She noticed things she'd never seen before. A flicker of movement in the bushes, a shadow that didn't belong. She felt a growing sense of unease, as if the neighborhood she'd always thought of as safe was hiding something dark beneath the surface. She found herself wondering if she'd been blind to the signs all along. One evening, as Marcus reviewed the footage from his new cameras, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, had approached his house late at night. They'd lingered near the door, as if trying to tamper with the lock again. Marcus's heart raced as he realized the danger he was in. This wasn't just a one-time thing. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. He called the police, showing them the footage. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but Marcus knew that wasn't enough. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He decided to take matters into his own hands, to dig deeper into the mystery that had turned his life upside down. But as he began his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than he could handle. Karen, meanwhile, found herself drawn into the mystery as well. She couldn't ignore the sense of dread that had settled over the neighborhood. She started talking to her neighbors, asking questions, trying to piece together what was going on. But the more she learned, the more questions she had. Everyone seemed to have a secret, a story they weren't telling. And as the days passed, the tension in the air grew thicker, more suffocating. The mystery of the device in Marcus's lock was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, there was something darker, something more dangerous. And as Marcus and Karen dug deeper, they realized they were in over their heads. The answers they sought were out there, but finding them would come at a cost. The question was, were they willing to pay it? For now, the neighborhood remained on edge. The sense of safety they'd once taken for granted, now a distant memory. Marcus and Karen, once strangers, found themselves united by a common goal, to uncover the truth. But as they got closer to the answers, they also got closer to the danger. And in the quiet streets of their once peaceful community, the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and more menacing with each passing day.